Good afternoon. My name is Alan Bernstein. I'm the president of the Felshtin Society. We're a group of about 250 people who are descended from the inhabitants of a town called Felshtin, now Vardiske, in the Ukraine. This is located in the south central part of the country, and it is and has been for millennia a small farming community. In 2019, we will commemorate 100 years from the time that Petlura's army of thugs invaded Felshtin and many other small towns all over the Ukraine, savagely murdering many Jews and others who were branded as enemies. Many of our forebears were victims, fled, or were already living elsewhere in 1919 when these horrible atrocities took place. In keeping with this upcoming centennial event, we feel that it is timely to look back on our family stories. First, we seek to memorialize the events that built our solid family foundations, to see what lessons might be learned from those who were closest to the trials and tribulations encountered as they raised their families and found a way to earn a living and become part of an entirely new world. Since we are now facing a world crisis of historic proportions regarding the number of people displaced by similar horror, perhaps there might be some way our stories could be of help, support, or hope for the millions now undergoing such an experience. Also, and not less importantly, we are seeking to memorialize these stories for our families and for the Felshtin community. These are important stories that deserve to be told and remembered by current and future generations. Furthermore, these stories will hopefully create a network of family histories that will fill the gaps between people who came and settled together, but who are now spread out beyond easy reach. So our goal is a simple one: to expand our human connections with a message of hope in a world full of despair. The story today has a special and personal meaning to me because Mel Werbach and his wonderful wife Gail were instrumental in seeing to it that a proper memorial was put in place to honor the dead in Felshtin. Their efforts against many obstacles were successful and led to our trip in 2010 to dedicate the monument and visit the area. So it is my honor to be here to talk with Mel about his memories of his family's struggle to survive and thrive in a new world. Mel, how you doing?
Fine.
Good to see you here. We're interested in learning about the lives of the direct descendants of the residents of Felshtin who were victims of the pogrom that took place in 1919. And you are someone who grew up with or were kin to people who actually came from Felshtin. We are hoping to gain insights about the immigration and acculturation experiences from first-generation people who observed the lives of those who came directly from the town. But before we start with your story of your family and your family's evolution in the new world, we'd really like to get a picture of your own life and your accomplishments, your education, your career, your family situation. If you could just give us a brief synopsis of your biography, that would be great. A great way to get started.
Sure. You want to start from early childhood and go up?
Yeah, sure. I mean, but yes,
Okay.
that would be great.
I was born in Manhattan, in Washington Heights, and born on November 11th, 1940. According to my mother, I broke the moment of silence at 11 a.m. There was a moment of silence to observe the atrocities of the war that was just beginning. and I broke it. I was born then and started screaming while everyone was standing silently. So I had an auspicious beginning to my life. My first 10 years were living in Manhattan, in Washington Heights. Then we moved to the suburbs, to Yonkers, New York, above the Bronx, on top of a hill that was called Colonial Heights, next to Tuckahoe. And I went to the various schools in that neighborhood. And then after graduation, I went to Columbia College for 4 years and decided to become a physician. So I applied to Tufts Medical School in Boston, where I got an early acceptance and went through my medical training there. After that, I did an internship at the Brooklyn Veterans Hospital by the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and spent 2 years doing government service. This was the Vietnam War. I was in what was called the Berry Plan. So I had an obligation of 2 years of government service. They placed me at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., which is since the national hospital, it was the national hospital for the mentally ill who didn't fit into any of the usual state boundaries. And so I did psychiatry there for 2 years, and from there I went to a psychiatric residency in Los Angeles at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, completed my residency training, and opened to practice. In between, I met my wife, Gail, who I met during an externship in Los Angeles, and dated her for a total of 2.5 weeks before we got engaged. And were married at the completion of my internship in 1967. So after my internship with my residency at Cedars-Sinai, I was given credit for 1 year of residency for the 2 years. I sort of moonlit in the National Institute of Mental Health's residency program in psychiatry while I was doing my service. And they gave me credit for formally 1 year of psychiatric training, so I could go into a second year of psychiatric residency. And after that, I took the exams to become certified as a diplomat in psychiatry. And started my practice in 1971. And I went through many changes through those years in terms of fields. I started with conventional psychiatric practice. To be brief, I got involved in the emerging field of biofeedback training, which at that time was a research field. I did research with the woman who originally coined the term biofeedback, and which originally was at the Sepulveda VA, and then we moved that to the City of Hope when her lab was closing down. I worked in the Department of Neurosurgery, the City of Hope, doing biofeedback research on pain. While at the same time I had my psychiatric practice, and later I incorporated that into my psychiatric practice, and was asked by UCLA if I would be willing to be a patient manager at the newly opened pain control unit there. I did so. I became the director of psychological services and clinical biofeedback at the UCLA pain control unit, became a professor at UCLA. And for several years I did that part-time while again continuing my private practice. That got me interested while I was there in nutritional medicine, because I realized people were saying there was no literature on it, and I found in the UCLA library tons of literature that wasn't really well known. So I decided someone needed to do it, so I might as well do it, and I started synthesizing the world's literature, scientific literature on nutritional medicine. And that became a series of books. My first book was on the history of medicine with a view towards alternative medicine where it seemed to fit in. And then afterwards I wrote a number of books on nutritional medicine. Best-selling one was Nutritional Influences on Illness that went through a couple of editions. I did a Nutritional Influences on Mental Illness. I did a book for the lay public for HarperCollins that was called Healing Through Nutrition. And wrote some other stuff too. Also for 16 years I did a column on nutritional medicine for a professional doctor's magazine. I had the last page of the 160-page magazine. They let me say whatever I wanted to say about what was going on in nutritional medicine, which was very nice. And meanwhile, my practice, again, continued to evolve. I brought in other alternative techniques at various points in time. Finally, I reached the point of deciding to retire, and I've been retired for a good number of years now. My wife and I divide our time between living in Los Angeles and living in a small rural community high in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada. In fact, we spend now the majority of our time in the mountain community. In the meantime, we've had two wonderful sons who have grown up, went to Harvard School in Los Angeles, one went to Brown University, went to Berkeley, and then went to Harvard Law School. The one at Harvard Law School is now living in Philadelphia, and the one who went to Brown is living in San Francisco. So we spend a lot of time commuting between seeing our sons and taking care of our grandchildren, which we're doing at the moment in Philadelphia, and going between our two home locations. So it's a busy, fruitful, productive retirement life that we're living at this point in our lives.
Mel, do you have siblings?
I have one sister who's 5 years younger and also lives in the Los Angeles area.
What's her family situation like? Does she have children?
She's married, has a son and a daughter.
Terrific. Mel, could you take us back a little bit to Washington Heights and give us a picture of what your living situation was like? You said for the first 10 years you lived in Washington Heights.
Right. Well, we lived in two different apartment houses. The first one was the first 4 years, something like that, and then we moved to it was basically a new building on Fort Washington Avenue. It was convenient because my elementary school was right across the street, so I just had to go across the street to go to school. And what would you like to know about?
I mean, what if you can give us an idea of what kind of neighborhood it was? Busy neighborhood, quiet residential?
Generally, I'd say quiet residential. There were a few stores in the neighborhood. It was Gideon's Bakery, which was a great Jewish bakery. Couple of couple of candy stores. It was a little bit like nowadays, looking back, like an old-fashioned town, even though it was in Manhattan, because in the little shopping area for Washington Heights, we had a number of stores. One was the grocery store, and I mean grocery store, I don't mean supermarket, where there was one grocer and he had one of those high tongs, so whatever my mother wanted, she could point to it, and with the tongs he'd get something from 20 feet above and bring it down. And I mentioned Gideon's Bakery was there, and also the butcher. The butcher was my favorite place to go. And you're going to ask me why it was my favorite place to go.
Go for it.
There were two reasons. There were two reasons. One, he would always give me a piece of bologna, And the other was, this was wartime originally, and I had my collection of string that I always worked on, and my collection of aluminum foil, and I would bring them into the grocer, and I believe I got a few cents for each. I was particularly proud of my collection of aluminum foil.
What could you tell us what the aluminum foil was all about?
For the war effort. They were collecting aluminum.
Wow. So kids would go around and
I
collect.
chew a lot of bubble gum.
Chew a lot of bubble. You have to be patriotic, right?
That's right.
Was it a large building or a relatively small building? A walk-up, elevators?
It was. Well, I don't know in those days how you would classify it. It was about 6 stories tall. I think we were on the 5th story, apartment 5J. Wadsworth 3. No, that was my grandmother's number. Wadsworth 87844.
That's pretty good.
Hers was Wadsworth 36690. I didn't need to know any other numbers in those days because I was 5 years old or something, you know. But it was a pleasant building, probably typical of New York. We really didn't know neighbors terribly well. I did know, of course, my doorman, who was Fritz, which is an interesting name, time of war. He was lovely to me, and I always enjoyed speaking to Fritz. Want me to tell you more about my lifestyle at that time?
Well, yeah. Well, you mentioned your grandparents? Were they living in the neighborhood as well?
Well, my father's parents were deceased. My father's mother, that's my father's family that came from Felshtin. My father's mother died giving birth to my uncle, my father's brother, and he remarried. My father's father, my grandfather remarried, but when my father, and this we'll talk about a little further down the line, when my father brought his father to the United States, he had throat cancer and didn't live very long. So the only grandparents I ever knew were my mother's parents. My mother's father died when I was 6, so I basically had one grandparent. And she came from Troy, New York. My mother's family, in general, all came from Troy. They immigrated to Troy in the late 19th century. They started coming around 1866. My grandmother was a very important figure for me in growing up, and a meaningful relationship with her. But I still find it hard to believe that people can have 2 sets of grandparents. It just seems like repetitious, you know.
Confusing.
Yeah, confusing, right.
But did she live nearby?
Yeah, she lived further down Fort Washington Avenue, maybe 10 blocks away, something like that. And my mother would let me take the bus once every few months or so, and I would take a bus to her apartment and spend the weekend at her apartment. And that was my vacation growing up, to be able to spend a weekend with my grandmother.
And in those days you could take a bus by yourself, right?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Kids could travel on the subway.
In fact, I think once I was 5 or so, or 6, she let me walk from, we were about 190th Street, she let me walk down to 181st Street, which was the shopping street. And I could go up and down 181st Street and, you know, buy things as long as I didn't spend more than my allowance.
Very important.
I don't think today that would be permitted.
Yeah. And Mel, could you talk a little bit about your parents in terms of, you mentioned your mother came from Troy. Can you tell us?
My mother didn't.
Your mother's family.
Yeah.
Mother's family. Can you tell us about your mother's background, her education or profession, or?
Well, my mother's parents were also born in the United States. So her family considered themselves to be very American, and actually didn't think much of my father because because he was a Russian and an immigrant, and they were very proud that they were Americans. Of course, the generation before had come from Poland and Lithuania, so it was one more generation back, so they were very proud of the fact that they were born in America. Still running?
Yeah, no, we're good. We're good.
As far as when we talk about her parents,
Sure.
Her father's family was a business family, basically. Her father was very successful, actually, and around 1900 he started buying up tenements, New York tenements, and he talked about, we were talking earlier about commercial real estate. He was big in commercial real estate around 1900, and bought and sold maybe 50 different tenement buildings in Lower Manhattan. I have all the records that I got from various New York newspapers and some of my research, and he either would buy and sell the buildings, or he would take out mortgages on the buildings. And while doing that, he also had a clothing store in Manhattan. So he ran both, and his wife, my great-grandmother, is listed just as much as he is, whether she had an active role or he just used her name. I don't know anything about what the relationship was, but she's listed on the documents for many of the purchases and sales, as well as he. But generally, he would turn them over. He would buy them, hold them for a few years, and then resell them.
Mm-hmm. And where was his store? You mentioned he had a store.
In Lower Manhattan, I don't remember the address or addresses offhand, but it was a clothing store, and I don't know if she ran the store when he was doing the real estate transactions or what the details were. I haven't learned that.
What was their life story like? I mean, how did they pass away, and what was
My grandparents.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my grandfather, he inherited part of the business from my great grandfather. So he did real estate, and also, I believe, had a business. Unfortunately, he invested a lot of money on 10% margin, which you can do in those days in the stock market. And a few years before the crash, there was a margin call, and he lost everything. So my mother, she grew up very wealthy in Harlem, which was for wealthy people in those days, with a chauffeur and a nanny, and a very nice bike, beautiful car, and everything else. And all of that they lost when she was probably, I think she was born like 1918, and this was the 20s, 23, 24, or something like that, when he lost everything. So they had to move out. They had to give up all of that and move to a small apartment, and never recuperated financially from the loss. So it was particularly hard on my mother, because she was raised as a wealthy little girl, and then suddenly became a girl without much money. And it was hard for her to adapt to the change in lifestyle. She also had an older brother who, I don't know how he handled it, but since he was older, it wasn't as much of a shock as it was to her. Everything that she knew was suddenly taken away from her.
How old was she when this happened?
Well, I was just calculating roughly. I think she was born it's either 1914 and 1918, and this was about 1923, 1924, so maybe 5, 6 years old.
Yeah.
I have pictures of her before and after. So, with she and her girlfriends leaning on the car with the chauffeur, a picture of the chauffeur, a picture of the nanny, and her with this bicycle that she really enjoyed on the sidewalk, and again, all of that suddenly disappeared.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And what did the rest of her life look like? I mean, where did she go to? Did she go to? What was her education?
Yeah,
like?
she was very bright. She was valedictorian of her high school class, and would have gone on to college, but they had no money, and so she decided she'd go on to business school, but they couldn't afford the books, and she got the business school made up. If she would get someone else to enroll, then they would give her, I think it was a partial scholarship or a scholarship or something like that. So that's how she went to business school. And then she got a job after that working for a stockbroker in Lower Manhattan. And did that until she met my father, who at that point had his own business.
What was he doing?
He started out selling novelties. Basically, he was in a store that had. I got photos of all of this. I think they had bunches of booths of people selling different things with the store, sort of a discount type store. And then he did pretty well with it and reached a point where by something like the 1930s, he formed a partnership with another man, and they opened a wholesale costume jewelry business on Canal Street, and started the jewelry section of Canal Street at that time. First to open a jewelry store there. And so he became a wholesaler of costume jewelry, did very well, expanded, and around 1945 or so, he left the partnership and opened his own place, which was Werbach's Admiration Jewelry Company, also on Canal Street, 243 Canal. And continued to do that until his retirement. He also bought an apartment building. He owned several buildings in Soho. He bought an apartment building on 86th Street near Gracie Mansion, which later became condoized when he sold it. And I used to, back in college days, I was, in a sense, his agent. I would come once a month to collect the rentals from the superintendent. I also earned some money by refinishing the elevator during college. It was a wooden elevator, and I stripped it all down, refinished it while people were going up and down. That's one of the ways I earned money for pin money during college.
In the good old days when you could do stuff like that,
Yeah.
and people were actually still using the elevator.
Right, exactly, exactly.
And because there was only one elevator in the building.
Yeah, yeah. So they did very well on their real estate investments. Unfortunately, they sold them very early because when they retired and moved to Florida, they didn't want to bother with them anymore and sold them. But was otherwise worth huge amounts of money. In fact, he once told me that he was offered the Metropolitan Life building. I don't know that he would have bought it entirely himself, but he showed it to me. He said, I could have owned this, but he had turned it down at the time. The Soho buildings were very inexpensive in those days, and now that area is totally changed.
They were all crummy industrial commercial buildings, with all kinds of loft spaces for manufacturing. And
right, he had several of them.
They were garbage,
Sure.
basically.
But the building, it was 519 East 86, was a lovely building, a very expensive building. I did very well on that.
I'm sure.
And as a child, I always remember one particular book in my parents' library. and it was a black book which had flames on the front with a word that I couldn't read. And my earliest days, I always remember that book, and once in a while I'd ask what it was, and my father would say it was about the town that he grew up in. When I got older, I got more curious, and I started thumbing through the pages, none of which I could read because of the language. And finally one day I asked my father more about it, and he told me a little at that time. And gradually, when I would ask questions, he'd tell me a little more about his growing up in Felshtin. He never really wanted to talk very much about it, but he would tell me a little bit here, a little bit there. If I asked a specific question, he would give me a specific answer. And I think I was in high school when I asked him one day, the idea occurred to me because I was very curious about it. Would you please, if I make a drawing, like a plan of a room, could you show me what your home was like? So he did that. I'd make a line here and a line there and say, well, where was the store? And the store was here, and where was the back of the store, and what was behind the store, and he gave me the layout and the approximate dimensions of his home in Felshtin. Later on, I learned that he had written a chapter in the Felshtin book, and he offered to translate it for me from the Yiddish. So we did. He did as good an English translation as he was capable of, so that I could read it. And gradually, the story of his experience in Felshtin became clearer over the years. The story starts actually not in Felshtin, but in Proskorov, which is the large market town not many miles from Felshtin. And his father had always wanted him to be a doctor or a lawyer, and apparently had enough money to be able to send him to school because the government, of course, would not pay for that. And for whatever reason, apparently there was a gymnasium, which is gymnasium's equivalent of high school in Felshtin, that my father didn't get into. So my grandfather sent him to the gymnasium, or a gymnasium in Proskorov. And when he was, probably started there when he was 14 or 15, I would guess. I'm not sure the exact age that it starts. So he was there living in the dorms, and one morning he awoke and he looked out his window and he found bodies side by side, many bodies all the way up and down every direction he could see, which was a very scary thing to find. And he said, what happened? And what happened was Proskorov had a pogrom. The Cossacks had invaded the town, or entered the town, and proceeded to kill every Jew they could find. Fortunately, my father was upstairs in the dorm, and they didn't go into the gymnasium, so his life was spared. But he immediately contacted his father, who sent a horse and cart, the driver, to pick him up.
Well, how did he immediately contact his father?
I don't know. I think he said he called. I'm not sure if they had telephones in those days or not, or it could have been Morse code, to the train station. I'm not sure what how he contacted him. Could have been a messenger. We were talking about 1919.
Right.
So I'm not sure, but he said he called him, but I don't know. My father sometimes was not exact as far as the details.
And was he living in the school in Proskorov?
Yes.
Or he was living there.
He was
Okay.
living there, yeah. It would be, I once did some research to try to find out before cars how much you could travel in a day. And a day's travel was 25 miles. So that would give you some idea I don't recall, maybe you do, exactly how many miles Felshtin was from Proskauer. I think at least 15
It was
miles.
about 15 miles.
Yeah, 15 miles. So it was, let's say, a 6-hour ride. So he certainly could not have commuted between the two.
Right.
Even if he had a fast horse, maybe 4 hours. So he lived there and proceeded to go back to Felshtin. He arrived at Felshtin, about 15 years old. Basically said, the town's going to be destroyed tomorrow. And no one listened to him. 15-year-old kid, what does he know? And of course he didn't know for sure that they were going to Felshtin. He didn't know where they would go from Proskauer. But he knew they were in danger. And it turned out he was right. I don't recall offhand, but it was either the next day or the day after that. I think it was the next day, I'm not sure. That the Cossacks arrived in Felshtin. My father reports in the Yiska book that they were on horses, they formed a big circle, and the leader said, we're going to do our holy duty now, go out and do your holy duty, which was to kill the Jews and destroy their homes. So they went around town, killing, maiming, raping the women. It was acts almost indescribable in their horror, from what I understand. They reached my grandfather's home and broke in, and my aunt had already married, so she wasn't in the house, but my father was there. I assume his younger brother was there, his stepsister was there, his stepmother was there, and my grandfather was there. My grandfather and his younger brother were unharmed, probably because they were hiding someplace successfully. My stepmother was stabbed, probably with a bayonet, by one of the Cossacks in the abdomen 16 times, according to the Yiska book. So she was severely wounded, mortally wounded. My stepsister was thrown brusquely against the wall with so much force that she became a cripple, a paraplegic, never recovered from that. My father ran outside and hid under a woodpile when a Cossack saw him, ran after him and started bayoneting the woodpile until they thought they had killed him. My father survived because, the way he explained it to me, he grabbed, when he could see the bayonet coming in, it must not have gone in too fast, the guy must have done it fairly slowly, he was just pushing down until he thought he hit the ground. And my father would wait until he could see the knife, and then he would grab the knife when it got right up against his chest and hold it as tight as he could. So the soldier thought that it had gone, penetrated his body, never bothered to look. So my father ended up just with superficial wounds on his chest, had a few minor scars from it, and survived. Then, upon leaving the town, they went around and they looked for the biggest Jewish homes in town and destroyed apparently 5 of them, all with grenades, and including my grandfather's house. So it was totally destroyed. Nothing was left.
And that was his house and his business,
And his
right?
business too, right. So I assume they stayed around for a little while because, as I mentioned, my step-grandmother was mortally wounded. There was no medical care, so she just lay, I don't know if she laid at some sort of facility in town because they didn't have a house anymore, and took her 2 weeks to pass on. And after she died, they fled to my father's mother's, my father's house. You know, this is my father's mother's father's house, my father's grandfather's house in Shumsk, and stayed there for a while, and then went from there to Lemberg, along with many other Felshtiners, to live in Lemberg until they could leave the country. My father was able to get a job at a lumber yard, so he worked there hauling lumber for something like a year and a half. And my father met with him and said, look, here's essentially whatever money I have left. Go to North America, make money, and then send for us. We'll wait for you. So they waited for him in Lemberg. He somehow or other, probably by train, got across to Hamburg, Germany. He was 16 years old at the time, and then was able to go third class to Nova Scotia. Stayed for I think it was a month in Nova Scotia because immigrants, for health reasons, weren't allowed out for a month, and studied along with his the other immigrants English. In fact, I have a photograph of them studying English from the blackboard while they were there. So by the time they left the boat, they already had a rudimentary ability to speak English. He took the train then to Winnipeg, where his cousins, the Gillets, were living. They had a small farm. He stayed at their house, which still exists today, and got a job as a linotypist at the Yiddish newspaper in downtown Winnipeg. I've got actually the stationery from there, and pictures of him there, and everything else. And he lived and worked in Winnipeg for a while, and then got a visa to come to the U.S. Arrived in the U.S., started a business selling novelties.
Who did he have in the U.S., in New York? I know it's New York.
He listed a cousin, but a person whose name I've never heard of, so I think it was fictitious. In those days, immigrants would often pay somebody to say that they were a relative. I don't know, I think we had any other relatives. Well, I don't know if his sister and her husband, if they had come. I don't think so. They fled to Argentina, and they worked as teachers for a couple of years in Argentina before coming to the United States. So, but I don't know anything about them having been there before him. I think they had their own travels and may have arrived even later than that.
Do you have any contact with descendants of your father's sister?
Yes, actually, I'm in touch with his granddaughter. She lives in Long Island now, and we've exchanged photos and memories, and so on. Her father is dead now, as well as, of course, her grandparents. But she and I do keep in touch periodically.
That's I didn't mean to take you off track.
No, that's fine. So my father started selling novelties within a bigger store, and gradually went into costume jewelry, and then into wholesale costume jewelry, and then around 1930 he opened the first costume jewelry store on Canal Street, which later became a jewelry center, and did fairly well with that, and later, I think in the late 40s, opened his own costume jewelry store, actually larger than twice the size or 4 times the size of the first one, called Werbach's Admiration Jewelry Company. And that he continued until he retired and moved with my mother to Florida.
What year would that have been, roughly?
When he retired, I don't recall. It was either the late 60s or early 70s, I'd say.
Okay.
So in the meantime, he had invested in real estate, so he accumulated a very nice real estate portfolio of buildings, and he sold that when they moved to Florida, and that gave them plenty of money for their retirement, so they were secure as far as retirees.
You have any idea how he got from the costume jewelry situation to investing in real estate?
Well, basically, they did well enough in costume jewelry that they didn't live on 100% of the income, and as their savings grew, they wanted to invest it, and they decided they were interested in looking into real estate, and that's how they started. Their main investment was a luxury apartment house at 519 East 86th Street, close to Gracie Mansion, and they named that Melroy Apartments after me, because I'd been born at that point. And they also bought a number of buildings, warehouse-type buildings in the area of Canal Street, which they also sold at the time.
My question is really about whether they did this independently on their own. Were they involved with other Felshtiners or other people that they associated with, that they went in together? Just curious to know their business plan, so to speak.
The real estate was independent. It was the two of them together. My mother was very sharp business-wise, and she and my father made all those decisions themselves.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Mel, what happened to your father's other siblings? When you mentioned that his brother and his father stayed in
well,
did they come over?
The stepsister escaped to Wolochisk, where my father had a cousin who may have taken her in. I don't know anything about the specifics of the story. And she lived there until the Nazis invaded and was murdered by the Nazis. As far as the brother, my father basically took him under his wing and hired him in his business, and he worked on a sort of managerial capacity until he died.
Mm-hmm. Did they come to the U.S. eventually?
Yeah, my father earned enough money that by the time he got to the United States, he could send them the money to come to. They came together. My grandfather and my brother.
And your father's brother.
My father's brother. I'm sorry, my father's brother. But my grandfather. I have two pictures of him. One was before the pogrom, and he was very successful and very well, and the other was his passport picture where he looked like a dying man. That was after the pogrom. His tie was on crooked, his shirt was half open, and you could see the toll that the pogrom had on him. The pictures were probably only a few years apart.
Mm-hmm.
And when he came to the United States, he almost immediately developed throat cancer and died before I was born. So he was a ruined man in many ways by the pogrom. I can certainly understand why. Mm-hmm. My father seemed to take it well. I mean, externally, but he was always very closed, and nothing would seem to bother him. It would bother most people. He would just shrug his shoulders. And I don't know what he was like, obviously, before the pogrom, but I would suspect there was a personality difference.
What makes you suspect that?
Because of this unusual ability to shrug his shoulders whenever anything went wrong. It was almost like he was saying non-verbally, compared to what I've been through, this is nothing. And we got through life that way.
Lunch is ready whenever you are. Are you still?
Just give us a few more minutes.
Now, you'll be meeting my father on the video
I hope so.
and interviewing him. I mean, you know, because Adam did this type of interview with him, so.
The big question, Mel, is we have two big questions. The first one is just in a kind of a more general sense. What role do you think their story, the family story, your father's story, have in your upbringing? What impact do you think you're bringing forward as the next generation from these events?
Well, some of that impact has to do with Gail, my wife, because she and I share very similar experiences. She also is the child of someone who went through not directly a pogrom, but had to flee as a result of the same sort of situation. She fled from Poland. Her mother actually grew up about 100 miles away from my father. And in fact, they have identical passports from 1921 from Warsaw, Poland. They may have even been online together, I don't know. it's rather remarkable. So we both share this very similar history of being the child of traumatized immigrants. My wife's mother's story is not quite as dramatic as my father's, but still it was a very difficult experience that she had fleeing with her family. So because of that, I think it shaped us, not just me, but shaped the two of us in terms of values, appreciating this country. We're intensely patriotic. We're very proud to be Americans and very grateful to be Americans. And I think we've passed that on also to our children. We feel very fortunate that we're in this country. And it's a feeling that's really strong among immigrant families. It's a characteristic, particularly when you come from a family background of oppression, particularly when it's been ruthless. So yes, it has really shaped us, and I think it shaped our kids. I think they appreciate all this country has to offer all the more because of the stories we've passed on to them as well as their grandparents.
Mm-hmm. What about the other side of the coin, Mel? On one hand, you feel grateful. On the other hand, are there concerns? Are there inordinate concerns about what might happen, what could happen, if we're just living in a bubble here?
I don't think they're inordinate concerns. I mean, they're realistic concerns. I don't think we're more worried than the next person may be about things that can go wrong. I think it may give us a little more of a world sense or a sense of time, and not expecting that what we have now we will always have. I think it's prevented us from becoming too, how can I put it, too complacent, or too even arrogant about saying, well, this will be the life for us and our children and our grandchildren forever. That other history is too close to us to make that mistake. But as far as being overly worried, no, I don't think so. Speaking to other people who don't have the immigrant experience, they're worried too. But maybe we feel it a little more because it's closer to us than it may be to them.
Mm-hmm. And how about your grandchildren? Your grandchildren have any sense of this family history, or any curiosity about it, or would they hold it as a special series of circumstances that got their family here in the first place?
Basically on the level of a assignment from school. Like Simon, who's our youngest, he's 8 years old, he called me last week and wanted to get some information about my father, since he was an immigrant, and had 5 questions to ask me, or something like that. You know, he goes to a Jewish day school, and they were particularly curious, I think, about immigrant families and how they came across and so on. So they learn about it, and sort of on that level. There's no emotional connection to it, like there is for my wife and for me. We're more emotionally connected in our generation, and that's pretty true in general. You know, first generation versus second and third generation. I think our sons have little feeling about it. I think the next generation already, it's so far off in time that it doesn't really mean anything. Depending upon the age of the grandkids, they may have briefly met one of my parents, but personally it doesn't have that weight anymore.
Do you think it's important to help them understand, or be willing to educate them about these past events?
Yes, oh yeah, no, we do our bit in trying to pass it on, but it has to be at the right time and place in terms of their own growth and development to mean something to them. The Felshtin book, which to me was sort of the magic book of my childhood, with stuff that I couldn't understand inside, to them doesn't have that type of meaning. It's just another book on the shelf. By the way, a number of years ago, I was able to secure another copy of the book, which I have for one of my sons, so that my copy will go to the other son. So each son will have a copy of the Yuska book. And I felt I wanted to do that. Comes to grandchildren, that's a little much to have another 5 copies, original copies.
Well, soon everybody can have a copy.
Right, but not the original.
That's true. That's true. No, is there anything else that you'd like to share about your experience or about your family story that you think might be good for us to understand here? In terms of a larger lesson than what we've talked about, about the one thing I can say is that as a psychiatrist, I've often looked at and thought about the effects that adversity has upon people, and I'm fortunate to not having had any of that adversity, but at the same time being close enough to it that it's part of my consciousness, and I think that does give you more perspective, more understanding, and I guess the word is rachmanis, in terms of being able to have a sense of feeling for that aspect of life, which being relatively affluent in the United States, it's very easy to miss that, to not have that sense at all of what it feels like to be impoverished, what it feels like to have killers on the loose going after you, what it feels like to have members of your family murdered in front of you. That's someplace in our DNA, which I think makes me a better person. You're a good guy, Mel.
Thank you.
We like you.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
My
I
pleasure.
appreciate your participation in this, and I think that you've done a great job of telling us your story.
Thank you. Glad to help.
Terrific. Thanks very much.